My wife cheated on me with our horrible neighbor while I was paralyzed, but a life-changing surgery gave me a second chance to rebuild my life. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in October. One moment I was heading to work, taking the same route I'd driven for 8 years, and the next moment I was waking up in intensive care 3 weeks later with tubes down my throat and no feeling below my waist. The doctors explained everything with that clinical detachment they're trained for: spinal cord injury, incomplete paralysis, months of recovery ahead, uncertain prognosis. My wife sat beside my hospital bed crying, holding my hand that I could barely feel, promising she'd be there through everything. Those first few months were brutal in ways I never imagined possible. Learning to navigate a wheelchair, dealing with the constant pain and muscle spasms, watching my independence slip away piece by piece. But the hardest part was seeing how it affected her. She tried to hide her frustration, but I could see it building. The way she'd pause just a second too long before helping me transfer from bed to chair. The forced brightness in her voice when she talked about our future. The way she'd stare out the window sometimes like she was planning an escape route. Our neighbor had always been a problem. He lived in the house directly across from us, a guy in his early 40s who seemed to take pleasure in making everyone around him miserable. Before the accident, he'd constantly play music too loud, let his dog run loose in our yard, and make inappropriate comments whenever my wife was outside gardening. I'd confronted him a few times, but nothing ever changed. After I came home in the wheelchair, he seemed to get worse, like he sensed weakness and wanted to exploit it. The rehabilitation process consumed everything. Physical therapy sessions that left me exhausted and discouraged, occupational therapy to relearn basic tasks, endless doctor appointments and insurance battles. My wife drove me to everything, helped me with personal care, managed our finances as my income disappeared and medical bills piled up. I watched her transform from the confident, vibrant woman I'd married into someone who looked perpetually tired and stressed. Around the 6-month mark, I started noticing changes in her behavior. She'd get phone calls and step outside to take them. She started going grocery shopping at odd hours, sometimes being gone for 3 or 4 hours for what should have been a simple trip. She'd come home with a flushed face and make excuses about running into friends or stopping by her sister's place. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the accident had made me suspicious and insecure. The first real sign something was wrong came when I was sitting by our front window one afternoon, doing the exercises the physical therapist had given me. I saw our neighbor's car pull into his driveway and my wife got out of the passenger seat. She looked around nervously before walking quickly to our front door. When she came inside, I asked where she'd been and she said she'd walked to the corner store. The lie hit me like a physical blow. I started paying closer attention after that. The unexplained absences became more frequent. She'd claim she was going to run errands and then come back hours later with nothing to show for it. She started showering as soon as she got home from these mysterious trips. Her phone was always face down now and she'd guard it carefully. The worst part was how she'd act afterward, overly affectionate and attentive, like she was trying to compensate for something. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in March. I'd been pretending to nap in the living room when I heard her talking quietly on the phone in the kitchen. I couldn't make out most of it, but I heard her say his name, our neighbor's name, followed by something about meeting tomorrow afternoon. When she hung up and came back into the living room, I asked her directly who she'd been talking to. She stammered some story about a wrong number, but her face gave everything away. The next afternoon, I positioned myself at the window and waited. Sure enough, around 2 o'clock, I saw her walking across the street to his house. She didn't come back for 3 hours. When she finally walked through our front door, I was sitting in the living room waiting for her. The conversation that followed was devastating but necessary. Through tears and broken apologies, the whole story came out. It had started innocently enough, or so she claimed. After one of his typical loud music episodes, she'd gone over to complain, and instead of being his usual obnoxious self, he'd been sympathetic and understanding. He'd invited her in for coffee and listened to her talk about how hard things had been since my accident. One thing led to another, and before she knew it, she was visiting him regularly. She swore it wasn't about love or wanting to leave me. She said she just needed to feel like herself again, to feel wanted and desired instead of just being a caregiver. She said she felt trapped and resentful sometimes, and he offered her an escape from that reality. She begged me to forgive her, promised it was over, said she'd do anything to make it right. But the damage was done. Every time I looked at her, I saw the betrayal. Every time she left the house, I wondered if she was really going where she said she was going. The trust that had held our marriage together for 12 years was completely shattered. I found myself lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I'd gotten to this point: paralyzed, betrayed, and feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my entire experience. She tried desperately to rebuild what we'd lost, but I could barely stand to be in the same room with her. Meanwhile, our neighbor seemed to take perverse pleasure in the situation. He'd wave cheerfully whenever he saw me at the window, or make a point of doing yard work shirtless when my wife was outside. It felt like he was rubbing salt in an open wound. I threw myself into my physical therapy with a new intensity. partly to distract myself from the emotional pain, and partly because I was desperate to regain some control over my life. My therapist started talking about experimental treatments and surgical options that might help restore some function. One procedure in particular caught my attention, a new technique that involved spinal cord stimulation combined with intensive rehabilitation. The success rates weren't guaranteed, but there was hope for significant improvement. The decision to pursue the surgery wasn't easy. It meant months of additional recovery, more medical bills we couldn't afford, and no guarantee of success. But at that point, I felt like I had nothing left to lose. My marriage was destroyed, my sense of self-worth was at rock bottom, and I was tired of feeling helpless. If there was even a small chance of regaining some independence, I had to take it. The surgery itself was longer and more complex than anything I'd been through before. When I woke up, the doctors were cautiously optimistic, but warned me that it would take weeks or months to know if it had been successful. The initial recovery was brutal, more pain than I'd experienced since the original accident, combined with the uncertainty of whether any of it would be worth it. But slowly, incredibly, things started to change. First, it was just tiny sensations, a slight tingling in my toes that made me think I was imagining things. Then small movements, barely perceptible at first but gradually becoming stronger. The physical therapists were amazed at my progress, and within 3 months I was taking my first tentative steps with the aid of braces and a walker. My wife was overjoyed at my recovery, seeing it as a chance for us to start over and rebuild our relationship. But something had fundamentally changed in me during those months of betrayal and darkness. I'd learned to depend entirely on myself emotionally, and I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. Her betrayal had forced me to confront who I really was when everything else was stripped away, and I'd found someone I could actually respect. The physical improvements continued steadily. 6 months after the surgery, I was walking short distances without assistance. 9 months later, I was driving again. A year later, I was more mobile than I'd been since before the accident. But the most important changes weren't physical, they were mental and emotional. I'd rebuilt my sense of self-worth from the ground up, and I'd learned that I didn't need anyone else to validate my worth as a person. During this time, our neighbor's behavior became increasingly erratic. As my recovery became obvious, he seemed to grow more frustrated and aggressive. He started making snide comments whenever he saw me outside, clearly resentful that his moment of power over the situation was ending. One evening, as I was walking to get the mail, he actually had the nerve to approach me and suggest that my wife had only stayed with me out of pity. That conversation ended with me telling him exactly what I thought of him in language that would have made my mother cringe. The final turning point came almost 18 months after the surgery. I was walking our dog around the neighborhood, something I'd never thought I'd be able to do again, when I realized I felt genuinely happy for the first time in years. Not just content or grateful, but actually happy. I'd rebuilt my life entirely on my own terms, discovered new interests and capabilities, and found a sense of purpose that didn't depend on anyone else. That evening, I sat down with my wife and had the most honest conversation we'd ever had. I told her that while I understood the circumstances that led to her affair, I couldn't forgive the betrayal itself. More importantly, I'd realized that our marriage had been built on a foundation that couldn't survive real adversity. We'd been comfortable together, but we'd never been truly compatible in the ways that mattered most. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly amicable. She admitted that she'd known for months that we couldn't go back to what we'd been before, but she'd been too afraid to face that reality. We divided our assets fairly, sold the house, and went our separate ways. She moved across town to start fresh, and I found a small place closer to the city center that was fully accessible and suited my new lifestyle perfectly. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into her at a coffee shop downtown. She looked healthier and happier than she had in years, and she told me she was seeing someone new, a guy she'd met through work who understood her need for independence and adventure. I was genuinely happy for her, and I think she could tell. We talked for about 20 minutes, and it felt like a conversation between old friends rather than bitter ex-spouses. As for our former neighbor, karma seemed to catch up with him in ways I never could have imagined. About a year after I moved out, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd been arrested for tax evasion. Apparently, he'd been running some kind of illegal side business from his home and hadn't been reporting the income. The investigation revealed all sorts of other problems: unpaid child support, outstanding warrants, even some kind of insurance fraud. He ended up losing his house and moving back in with his parents at age 43. The whole experience taught me things about resilience and personal strength that I never would have learned otherwise. Yes, the accident was devastating and the betrayal was crushing, but they also forced me to discover who I really was when everything familiar was stripped away. I learned that I could survive complete devastation and come out stronger on the other side. These days, my life looks completely different than it did before the accident, but in many ways it's better. I'm more selective about the people I let into my inner circle, more intentional about how I spend my time, and more appreciative of simple pleasures like being able to walk to the corner store or drive myself to dinner with friends. I've developed new hobbies, made new friends, and discovered interests I never knew I had. The physical recovery wasn't just about regaining the ability to walk. It was about reclaiming my sense of agency and independence. Every step I took was a victory over the circumstances that had tried to define me. Every milestone in my recovery was proof that I was more than just a victim of bad circumstances. I still deal with some physical limitations and ongoing pain management, but they don't define my daily experience the way they once did. I've learned to work around the challenges and focus on what I can do rather than dwelling on what I can't. The mental and emotional growth that came from surviving those dark months has served me far better than perfect physical health ever could have. Looking back now, I can see that the accident and its aftermath were actually a turning point that led me to a much more authentic and purposeful life. The betrayal hurt terribly at the time, but it also freed me from a relationship that wasn't really serving either of us. The neighbor's cruelty revealed his own character flaws more than it said anything about me. And the long journey of recovery taught me that I'm capable of overcoming challenges I never thought possible. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not trying harder to save my marriage or if I'm bitter about everything that happened during my recovery. The honest answer is no. All of those experiences, as painful as they were at the time, led me to become the person I am today. I'm stronger, more self-aware, more compassionate, and more resilient than I ever was before. The life I'm living now is entirely my own creation, built on a foundation of genuine self-respect and hard-won wisdom. The surgery gave me back my mobility, but the real transformation was emotional and psychological. Learning to walk again was just the external manifestation of learning to stand up for myself in every area of my life. The second chance wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about rebuilding everything from scratch and doing it right this time.